Toilet paper was a luxury, and the common practice was to use a Sears Roebuck catalog or Montgomery Ward catalog. These catalogs were mailed to millions of people every year. We got ours each year.
And the thousands of pages of the old one were immediately repurposed.
It must have cost the companies enormous amounts of money to prepare those catalogs and have them printed and sent out.
When Sears started business around the turn of the century, the population was primarily rural, and the only way they could contact them was through these catalogs. And the farmers and rural population responded with great acceptance because it gave them an opportunity to buy things that they probably never saw before or again in their lives. Sears and Ward, Montgomery Ward, were the Amazon of that early 20th century time frame. It's hard to imagine how they kept track of all this stuff that was listed in their catalog, because in those days that was even before the era of punch cards, and they all had to be manually entered and deleted and shipped and addressed. And an incredible project. They have thousands of people working in Chicago doing that, but even so, the chance of error and confusion must have been immense, and the warehouse required to store this stuff, it's beyond belief. The variety of product was not restricted to any type or size. They sold, you can see this big old cast iron stove for $13. And this house here for a little over $1,000, and they had quite a variety of pre-cut houses of different styles and shapes and rooms and prices. Furniture of all types, big guns. I sold children's clothing and women's shoes and men's suits and just about anything you wanted.
But it was always interesting to read and look through the catalogs, and it was called a wish book because you wish you had the money to buy this dress or that bicycle or that tool. And in fact, in 1940, my Dad told me that I could order a bicycle from Sears, but I couldn't spend over $25 for it. So I knew exactly what I wanted. I wanted a bicycle with, of course, a headlight, a horn, and a tail light, and I wanted a gear shift, and I wanted a coil spring knee action on the front wheel. Well, that set of accessories jacked the price of the bicycle to $27 and some cents, and I could either have the gear shift or the knee action, and it wouldn't break the $25 limit. That either one of those was a $2 and something adder that was beyond my permission, and Dad wouldn't he wouldn't let me have the extra $2 and something. I had to make a choice. So I took the knee action because the roads were so rough. I figured that would give me a little less jolting ride.
I found this picture on eBay of a bike that's similar to the one I had, only mine had a headlight and a horn and knee action. But essentially it's just the same massive bicycle that this picture.
Bicycle weighed pounds when it was delivered, and it was so heavy. And with all the hills around there, I couldn't go up any hill. I had to get off and push it up the hills. So that was my penalty for choosing comfort over the utility of having the ability to gear it down and be able to pedal up the hills at a lower gear. I had such a difficulty with the hills that it really wasn't a very practical bicycle for me. But I did ride it back and forth to Frenchville 1,000 times, pushing up every hill. And it was a lot faster than walking, and I didn't have any objection to riding it, that's for sure. Several times I'd ride to Frenchville during the summer and meet up with a friend, Willard Plubell, that I had met somehow. He had built a ramp, a leading ramp and a descending ramp with a gap of about 6 feet between them. So I'd go over there and we'd come down this hill and ride up the rising ramp and jump the gap and land on a descending ramp and repeat that process 100 times. I remember one time some kid, and I don't remember who it was now, but he wanted to try it on his bike, and he chickened out on the up ramp, and he lost his speed and fell between the ramps in the gap. And he got pretty well battered up. He crashed the front wheel on his bicycle. There was no turning back once he made a commitment. When our youngest one was about 15 or so, he had suffered the same disastrous results as the one I just described in Trenchville. I don't know what happened, whether he chickened out on the up ramp or not, but something happened where he landed in the gravel between the ramps. And I just returned from Japan, and they met me at the Evansville airport, and I got off the plane, and I saw this kid sitting on a bench near the doorway there, and I walked right by him. Oh, I could see Shirley standing over a little further, and I walked right by this kid without knowing that it was my youngest. His face was all puffed out about twice its size and full of nicks and gouges, and he had landed right on his face. He was so distorted I didn't even recognize him. Advertising in the 30s and 40s was, well, even the 50s, but especially during the 30s, the liberties, well, it wasn't liberties then, it was the mindset of the population and the advertisers was certainly different than it is today. I think you'll find these ads, which were pretty typical, and but I think you'll find them pretty funny. This was an ad for a postage meter, and the convoluted conversation that's printed here is really pretty amusing. This cigarette ad is also pseudo-scientific. A number of 20,679 physicians agree that Luckies were less irritating, which admitted inadvertently that cigarette smoking was irritating. Same with this report, that Philip Morris reduced irritation. This is something that wouldn't pass too well today with women's rights. Back in the good old days when men were men and women were women, there were all kinds of health ads and beauty treatments that some were downright dangerous. Pretty peculiar to see an ad that's advertising how to gain weight. And of course this one works the other way. It's talking about being too fat. So before the war, silk was the only material available for women's stockings, and they were very fragile, and the least little nick on them would cause them to run. In other words, that white stripe down that woman's leg is what's called a run, where the material weaving comes apart and exposes the bare skin in that strip. And of course runs were always an issue, and I don't think women wore them very often. During the war, silk was not available, and women painted their legs, as I'll describe a little later. But you can see by the grim look on the husband's face that a serious domestic issue is brewing. It's kind of comical to see how formally they're sitting there in their living room in the evening, relaxing while she does her domestic duties and he reads the financial section. It seems that there's a certain percentage of the population of males in our country during that time that were very sensitive to dishpan hands and the quenching of romance that those nasty, rough fingers communicated to them. You can see he's thinking about some other gal that he'd better start sprucing up to, because this one isn't going to work out. This is unbelievable. I wonder who came up with this one. What person would enjoy having smoke blowing in their face? Especially smoke from those cheap plastic tipped cigars that he's smoking. Boy, this gal's really screwed up. That guy's ready to hit the road because she didn't have the proper feminine hygiene. Whoa, boy. Yeah, you can tell he's a sophisticated man of the world, and she's going to get dumped here in a minute if she doesn't shape up. Look at this, poor Dave. He's got a woman trying to break down his door. That's a problem I was always plagued with. Another thoughtless, uncaring woman. The Kellogg's all brand making dating impossible. I like this one. The harder a wife works, the cuter she looks. Does my black heart good to see a woman working. This is really, really great here too. Yeah. And the generous husband not being upset with a burnt supper as long as she didn't harm the beer. Pretty funny ads. In case you're wondering who that is, that's me in disguise. And that's Shirley on the floor there, of course. Look at this doctor with his flush face and overweight. He looks like he's prime candidate for a heart attack. Women wore all kinds of foundation garments in those days. My mother wore things like that too. These sharp looking suits. These prices are low, but so is the income. Uh, it's hard to imagine a suit being priced at those levels. I always wanted one of these, but of course, it never happened. These ads are hilarious to us today, at least they are to me, but they really do represent the mindset of the people before World War II. This women's place was in the home and obedient to her husband, to the proper restraints, of course. It had to be mutual respect, but the woman was the second in command, and the man was in charge of the household, which is really scriptural to the T. But World War II stirred this up and just wiped out this type of thinking because women's liberation was in its nascent state, and the war had proven that women could do a lot more than men gave them credit for, and to their own surprise too. When it came right down to forgetting the restrictions and the mindset of eons of time and getting to the job that had to be done now, these ideas and restraints were cast aside, and women became much more predominant in their own station in life. And I'm not sure that that's really benefited the women. I really don't understand why a woman wants to be a man, because a woman has the power behind the throne, which is a lot more subtle and it doesn't have to face the spears and arrows of outrageous fortune that the man has to face out in the world. Her life doesn't have to include that kind of aggravation and difficulty when she accepts her second in command position. But when she leads the family and leads the home and lets the man accept her responsibilities, industry or wherever, she takes on both jobs. And she's lost her sweet spot, in my opinion. Of course, I'm just an old man who's got a lot of goofy ideas, but I think a woman is happier at home, protected by her husband from the world as much as possible. And if she can depend on him, lean on him, and accept his leadership, I think she can find much more satisfaction in life. And I say that because I think that's the way our family was. I certainly was. I had a lot of this mindset, still do, as a matter of fact. And I sheltered my wife from as much as I could from my own difficulties at the job and disappointments and so forth. But and she depended on me for the leadership, and I didn't always do a good job, but I did accept the responsibility for maintaining our house and financing and so forth. Anyway, I can say one thing. We had 68 years of a blessed marriage. It wasn't smooth all the time, that's for sure, but when I look back, it was blessed right from the first moment until the last. During World War One, a doctor invented this machine that he could look through the boots of wounded soldiers to see what kind of damage the feet and legs were before removing the boots. And after the war, he developed the machine a little further and began to sell it as a shoe fitting device. And it became very popular during the 20s and 30s, and it wasn't until the late 50s when the damage from radiation really became obvious from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombs that these machines were banned from the United States. So there were a lot of people exposed to X-rays unknowingly during all those years. There were some feet and legs suffered radiation burns and the subsequent issues dealing with those types of injuries. But though it was highly advertised and it was very popular, people came into the stores just to look to see their feet wiggle, and especially children. It was a real, after the school day, entertainment to go into the shoe store and stand there and for long periods of time under these dangerous rays and watch your feet wiggle. Before there were interstates and everybody drove on two-lane roads during the 30s and 40s especially, this company called Burma Shave, who made shaving cream, conceived this advertising program that was unique and highly successful because everybody in the country knew what a Burma Shave sign was. They posted everywhere in the country 5 signs about 100 feet apart, and each one contained one line of a 4-line couplet. The 5th sign had the obligatory Burma Shave advertising. Of course, everybody knew right away that what they were reading. I have copied a number of these, and I'll just read 2 or 3 from my book, An Octogenarian Remembers. They're pretty funny. The first one we read is that at intersections, look each way. A harp sounds nice, but it's hard to play. Car in ditch, driver in tree. The moon was full, and so was he. He kicked the gas, and then the bucket. A man a miss, a car a curve. He kissed the miss and missed the curve. Brother Speeder, let's rehearse, all together. Good morning, nurse. Anyway, there were thousands of those little ditties that were amusing and certainly did their job in advertising Burma Shave. I think it was about 1938 when we decided, or rather Dad decided, and Mom, to drive to Williamsport to visit his brother Ed that lived down there. Now Williamsport is 100 miles away, and that was a long journey, and I remember the preparations that went into that. Had to grease the car and change the oil, and it was... Anyway, I remember driving down there, and it didn't seem to take all that long. But we got there, and we visited Uncle Ed and one of his boys, James was his name, and he was a bartender. And we went over to the bar where he was working, and he had, I think he was just an employee, but anyway, the bar had installed a neon sign, which was a brand new invention. It had advertisements for some beer, and it was unique in its appearance. But I remember seeing that sign. I wondered how they could make a glass tube glow red. He lived in an apartment with his wife. Peggy was her name, and she was a pretty good-looking woman. I remember other people commenting on her shape and her appearance, and she was. I was, well, probably 9 years old then, but I could see that she wore makeup and things that I didn't see very often. They lived in a second-floor apartment in this house, but there wasn't any heat up there, and the only heat came from a register cut through the floor above the kitchen stove in a kitchen down on the first floor. And so some heat came through there from that coal-fired kitchen stove. I remember my sister and I looking through that grate, and we spit down through that grid, that grill onto the hot grid of the stove below. We were hard up for something to do, I guess. We stayed there overnight and came back the next day. A big journey. Just before the war and during the war, a fad started in New York City among young people, and this fad was involved wearing an outlandish outfit called a zoot suit, Z-O-O-T suit, and it was really a weird setup. People, young men, boys, wore this outfit. The pants were tight at the ankle and then ballooned out, and the waist was up way high, up around the breasts, and a long coat like formal tails then was worn with that hung way down, and there was a long chain, maybe 6 feet long, decorative chain hung then from the vest pockets of the outfit, and of course they wore sharp pointed shoes with spats. And it was a weird outfit. And the hat was a huge brimmed hat with low center rise on it. We lived on a farm with animals, and those animals were very sweet spots for flies. And so with the pigs and the chickens and the cow, the fly population was very well nourished. So on the house we had screen doors, and they were always closed and kept in good condition. But regardless of that, the flies just got into the house. It was a hopeless battle to keep them out. And one of the things that Mom did, of course, in addition to fly swatter, was to hang sticky fly-catching tapes that you bought in a small tube about the size of a shotgun shell, and it pulled out this strip that was covered with very tacky material, and with a thumbtack stuck it into the ceiling, and this 2-foot long strip of sticky tape, once they touched that, they were unable to get off. So most of the time this strip was a withering black mass of flies. It was pretty bad, really. My dad made fly traps out of cones of screen door material with a bait underneath the open end. Flies got underneath the open bottom end of it, fly up inside the cone, and were trapped. They didn't have enough sense to fly back down next to the floor. And of course flies around the barn, around the cow, and tormented the animals, particularly the cow, all summer long. But that was part of being on the farm, and all farms have flies. It's inescapable. One thing, as I reflect on my youth, one thing that was never said and mentioned was manners. We ate at the table using a knife and fork, obviously, but Mom and Dad never said anything about manners, and of course we followed what they did. We learned from visual experience, my sister and brother and I, but there was never any comment about eating in public and the manners that are expected of you. It was just learned by observation as we got older. We didn't have any liberal arts education, either at school or at home. It just wasn't, it didn't seem to be an issue that needed attention, but it obviously did. And I think we'd have benefited by instruction on manners between people and how to get along and the normal kind of activities. I didn't have any real friends until I met my wife. All of the kids in the school, the grade school, were not my friends or confidants, and I never played with them outside of school times, school recesses. And even then, it was a minor contact. And then at home, of course, there wasn't anybody. Once I got home to the farm, I was isolated. So, and then in high school, going to high school every day for 4 years, I did make friends with several guys and so forth, but they weren't really confidants, and they were acquaintances, and I had some fun with them and so forth, but they weren't close. So my wife, Shirley, was my only true lifelong friend. At home, between Frenchville and the farm, there was a lane that went back into the woods, and an old couple lived back there, and their name was Noll, N-O-L-L, and George was his name. I don't know her name. I only ever saw her once, and that's what I'm going to talk about right now. One day, Dad and I, for some reason, Dad wanted to go over to see George, and nobody ever went back there. He wasn't really a very friendly guy. He was a wizened up old guy without any teeth, and he was a character. He was a tough old bird, though, and used to hard work and so forth. But in any case, we walked back there, and it was probably half a mile off the dirt road, up his lane through the woods into his house. And I remember as we approached, this was a small little house, just a clapboard house with a porch, and the porch posts were trees that had been cut in the right length and used to support the roof. And it was in the evening, in the summer evening, and George and his wife were sitting on the porch on rocking chairs in the shade there, among the trees. There was plenty of shade, obviously. And as we approached, I smelled something peculiar, which was an unpleasant odor. And I noticed that Mrs. Noll was sitting there on the chair, and she had her dress in the front where her breast would be. The dress was, I could see the skin where her breasts had been. And it was a terrible sight I've ever seen. She had cancer, and it was gruesome. That's all I can say. And flies were around. She didn't live long after. I'm surprised she lived as long as she did, and she didn't obviously have anybody to take care of her or give her any medical aid. It was a terrible sight to see that impoverished woman suffer like that. He's the guy that hewed a new beam for our house. I remember when I was small, Dad had built a house, and apparently there had been a leak or something. I don't know why, but there was a 10 by 12 inch square hewn beam that rotted, and so it needed replaced along the back edge of the house. So Dad hired George Noll to hew this long pine tree that Dad and I had cut, to hew it into a square. And he did that. It took him several days of hand chopping. He made it square and it looked good, and he helped Dad install it into the house. One of our distant relatives was was named John Picar, and he lived north of Frenchville in the woods with a woman, Estelle was her name. I can't remember her last name, but she had buck teeth. She was not a beauty, that's for sure. But he was an older guy, and his wife had been dead for something. I never saw her. I don't know how long when she died, but several sons were around there, Jess and Newt, I remember. But in any case, John and Estelle liked booze, and of course during the Prohibition you had to buy it from local manufacturers. He had a 31 Plymouth with suicide doors. The doors open from the front edge rather than the trailing edge. And so if those doors were opened while the car was moving, the wind would snatch them and tear it off. One day we heard the old car going by pretty fast, and John and Estelle had been over to a neighbor and got pretty well tooted up, and they were really traveling fast toward Frenchville again. And not fast, I mean like 30 or 40 miles an hour, which was fast on those roads. And there was a sharp curve up the northern corner of our farm, and a big pine growing right along the edge of the road. And as they passed, we were all knowledgeable about the sharpness of that curve and whether he was going to make it at that speed. Well, it didn't take long to find out that he didn't make it. We heard a crash, and so we ran up to see if we could help. And John and Estelle were still sitting in the car, and steam was coming up off the radiator, and the front end of the car was pretty well wrapped around the tree. The car was totaled, but they weren't hurt. I guess they were too drunk to get hurt, but they sure put an end to the car.
One of the things I remember when I was a little kid in the early 30s, actually, in 1925, cave exploration down here in Kentucky around Mammoth Cave, which is just 50 miles south of where I'm at now, was a great tourist attraction. And of course, during the 20s, people were working in prior Depression days, so there were cars, and people traveled a lot more than off the beaten paths. So Mammoth Cave was a pretty good attraction, and the locals down there knew that there were caves everywhere in that part of the region. So there was a lot of exploration by people that lived there. And in 1925, there was a man by the name of Floyd Collins who was a young man, and he was adventurous, and he explored caves as a hobby. And in January, he was out exploring, and he found this cave called Sand Cave, and he went into it, and it's a large cave, it's a tourist attraction today. But he went in there, and he squeezed through some pretty tight holes and discovered these large rooms, immense caverns in there. But the access to them was through a really tiny spot where he could just squeeze his body. He had to keep his arms down to his sides and force his way through the hole with his feet. And on this day, on January 25th, 1925, he decided he'd better go back home because his kerosene lantern was threatening to go out. So coming back through that really tight spot, and there were a number of them, but this was the worst one, a rock fell from above and landed on his legs, and the loose dirt that rock brought down partially buried him, lower part of his body, just as he was getting through that really tight place. So he lay there on his stomach, trapped with his arms to his sides and his feet buried, and he was unable to dislodge the rock. And reports say that the rock weighed 13 pounds, and some say it weighed 26 pounds. That was down on his ankle and his lower feet, but it doesn't matter. It was too much that he couldn't dislodge it from the place it was in. It was wedged between the sides of the hole. So he was trapped there, and so when he didn't return that day, the next morning they sent out a search party, and they found his jacket at the entrance to the cave, so they knew where he was at. And they went down and they found him there, but they couldn't dislodge him either. They couldn't reach the rock. It was on the other side, and they couldn't pull him out. He was too tightly wedged in the opening.
So they tried different things. They tried put a rope around his chest and tried to pull him out, but they couldn't do it. So the days went on, and they were getting desperate, and word spread of Floyd Collins's entombment, and it spread all over the world over the next 3 or 4 days, and thousands of people drove down there, and there was a lot of arguing about how to get him out, and there was no leadership, but there was a lot of animosity and infighting among people who were looking for fame and glory to save Floyd Collins. Well, after 4 or 5 days, they were unable to continue bringing him food and water because there were other cave-ins being threatened. In fact, one man almost got trapped himself from falling debris, so they couldn't go back down to give him any sustenance, or nobody was willing to take the risk. But it was rather a long way back into the hole where he was trapped, and of course it's dark and wet, and it was raining and 20 degrees and snowing, and the weather was terrible. It was wet inside the cave, and anyway, they finally organized and got a crew together of 70 men and started digging a vertical shaft down to where he was trapped. They couldn't agree on where to begin the digging, and they lost almost a whole day on that issue. But in any case, digging down through that was very treacherous and dangerous. It was mucky and difficult to evacuate, and of course the rain kept everything wet and muddy, and of course rock layers and so forth they had to penetrate. But anyway, after 7 or 8 days they got down 55 feet, and on the 17th day they arrived at where he was trapped, but he was already dead. He had been dead about 24 hours apparently before they reached him. So he starved to death actually, and well, probably a lack of water too. But the story of his death and the story of his entombment and death spread over the world. And you know, this happened 5 years before I was born. But even as a young kid, I remember the conversations that neighbors or somebody had, because I've never forgotten it. I guess the horror of it, the thoughts of being trapped and entombed, and then eventually being lost. If you let that prey on your imagination, you can somewhat appreciate the nightmare that he went through before he died. The story of his death in that pitch black, cold and wet and hopelessly trapped. Well, I think I'll end this one here, and we'll go to the next one.